There has been a growing trend in Australia's cities, and many other cities around the world for that matter. That being that cars seem to keep getting bigger and bigger, with the rise in popularity of very large SUVs and the now quite infamous giant American-style pickup truck. These cars have earned various nicknames, from so-called yank tanks to emotional support vehicles, and they tend to look pretty out of place on Australia's streets, that were long dominated by mid-sized sedans and small hatchbacks. Even compared to what we would typically think of as a ute, they are a lot bigger. Where a Holden Commodore might be just over 5 meters in length, a Dodge Ram can get upwards of 6.5. The Ram is also quite a bit wider at around 2.5 meters compared to the approximate 1.9 for the Holden. And the story is the same when it comes to height, with the Ram being a good 25% taller than the Commodore. So the Dodge Ram and other cars like it are a lot bigger than the kinds of utes we're used to seeing on Australian roads, and that is causing some problems. Quite prominently, they are struggling to fit inside standard Australian parking spaces, which has earned them quite a bit of negative attention on places like Reddit, and has even led to Standards Australia suggesting we may need to increase the sizes of parking spaces to accommodate them. But why have these cars become so popular in the first place? Well, it's not just the big American-style pickups. Australia's car buying habits in general have been trending bigger. The proportion of new vehicles sold as light commercial vehicles, aka utes, has been steadily increasing, but the average size of these utes has been increasing as well. Even that Holden Commodore I mentioned earlier as an example of a more reasonably sized ute would have been considerably smaller a couple of decades ago, with a Commodore sedan from the 1970s being smaller than a Volkswagen Golf of today. This preference for bigger cars extends beyond just oversized American-style utes. SUVs have surged in popularity as well in recent years. In fact, in the last year, over 50% of new cars bought in Australia were SUVs. And if you include light commercial vehicles and 4x4s in this, you get up to 2/3. Meanwhile, sales of the more reasonably sized sedans and hatchbacks have plummeted. There are plenty of theories as to what's caused this shift. One obvious one, particularly relating to light commercial vehicles, is that there are some pretty substantial government incentives to get one. When you buy a car capable of carrying more than 1 ton of cargo, it gets classified as a work vehicle, and is as a result exempt from certain taxes. What doesn't matter, however, is if that car is ever actually used for work. So you have a lot of people taking advantage of tax breaks intended for tradies who genuinely need cars like utes for work, despite having no real need for anything more than a hatchback themselves. Speaking of hatchbacks, for people who actually prefer to drive smaller cars, well, they're becoming increasingly hard to buy. Many car manufacturers in Australia have been progressively phasing out their smaller car models in favour of larger SUVs. Honda, for example, has stopped selling its Honda Jazz hatchback in Australia, with the director of Honda Australia citing the higher profitability of its larger SUV range as a key reason for this. That said, Honda does still manufacture the Jazz for other markets where there is still a strong market and more favourable regulations for smaller cars. What this means for Australia, however, is that outside of the used car market, it can be pretty hard to buy anything other than an SUV or a ute. And as these cars fill up our roads, people driving smaller cars face being surrounded by cars that are much larger than theirs, which legitimately causes issues around reduced visibility and feelings of lack of safety, leading to these people feeling compelled to go larger with their next car purchase. And they aren't too wrong to be concerned about safety. Australia's road death toll last year was its highest in over half a decade, and many have suggested that at least part of the blame lies in the ever-increasing size of the vehicles on our streets. Professor Stuart Newstead from Monash University told The Guardian that as people switch to larger car models, they're increasing the risk of serious injury to other road users by 1/3. And analysis from the Sydney Morning Herald has found that as Australia's most popular cars have gotten larger, the likelihood of crashes resulting in serious injury or death has increased. Despite this, many people still hold the belief that if they buy a larger car, they'll be more protected on the road. But even if we just consider the people inside the car, this doesn't always hold up. Now, the findings in the research do vary, but there have been a few studies that have found that SUVs and other large vehicles can pose more of a danger to their occupants than other car types, with one finding that people are 11% more likely to die in a crash while in an SUV. Though perhaps the biggest victims of increasingly big cars are pedestrians and cyclists. Quite simply, being struck by a larger and heavier object unsurprisingly does more damage than a smaller one. But not only have these studies found that when a pedestrian is struck by a larger vehicle like an SUV that they're more likely to suffer severe injury or death, these studies have also found that pedestrians are simply more likely to be struck by somebody driving a larger car in the first place. The reason given for this is that in a larger car the driver sits higher up, and as a result will have a harder time seeing things near the ground by their car. This is particularly true for young children, many of whom are absolutely dwarfed by these cars. Beyond just safety, these larger cars come with big environmental concerns. At a time when we are increasingly trying to reduce our carbon emissions, the growing popularity of oversized cars is having the opposite effect. SUVs alone contribute over 1 billion tons of CO2 to our global emissions. And in fact, while car engines have generally become more efficient and less polluting over time, the benefit of this has been basically completely erased by the uptake of larger and, as a result, more polluting vehicles. So I think it's pretty clear there are some fairly big downsides to the soaring popularity of these supersized cars. But are we actually doing anything about it? Well, sort of. Yarra City Council in Melbourne's inner suburbs has recently voted to explore higher parking fees for drivers of large utes and SUVs. This council covers some of Melbourne's oldest suburbs, which were built long before the age of the car and where streets are often too narrow to accommodate these large new vehicles. While the motion in the council was carried unanimously, it is still early days and we don't have any real indication of how much more these drivers might be paying. This policy does, however, echo recent moves being made over in Europe, where old narrow streets are also facing similar issues with modern oversized cars. In Paris, for example, a recent referendum has seen Parisians vote to triple parking fees for SUVs. And other cities like London and Oxford have started looking into implementing similar measures. Back in Australia, in New South Wales, the Greens have also been pushing to implement similar policies. But again, there doesn't seem to be too much movement on this just yet. In my view, changes to parking charges are a start, but they may not be nearly enough to convince people to ditch their oversized utes or SUVs. These cars are already very expensive. A Ford F-150 can set you back well over $150,000. So I'm not convinced the extra few dollars for some inner city parking is going to make much of a difference. Now of course there are always going to be people who have the genuine need for larger cars for their jobs. And these do need to be considered. However, for those that don't, we are going to need to be far more aggressive with our policies if we actually want to encourage them to drive smaller and more efficient cars, or even better, take public or active transport. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I am curious to get your guys' opinions on these sorts of cars and what we should do about them, so leave a comment if you have any ideas. If you did enjoy the video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you aren't already. And as always, I'm City Moose, thanks for watching.